This message comes from Whole Foods Market. Shake up dinner time at Whole Foods Market with bold flavors. Now through the 25th, shop the Fire Up Asia sales event in store and online. Kick dinner time up a notch at Whole Foods Market.
What's good? You're listening to Code Switch. I'm Gene Demby. So over the last few Mondays, we've been talking about football, which is America's most popular sport, and it's not even really close, yo. And it's a sport with an almost unavoidable physical toll. I mean, we're only just now starting to be real about the extent, the cost that comes from playing this sport. And those costs don't just pile up for the folks who went pro, right? Like Dominic Foxworth, who was our guest last week. There's been so much more reporting and research about the dangers of concussions and brain disease among young people who play the sport in peewees in high school. Knowing that is not necessarily dampening Americans' love for watching football, but it does seem to be changing who is picking up the ball and putting on the pads and deciding to play. The Washington Post did a big feature not too long ago that found that the numbers of kids is actually in decline and that fewer black and white kids are playing it. The number of Latino kids, though, is actually on the rise. They also found something of a red state, blue state divide on this, with conservatives more likely to say that they would allow their kids to play football, while liberals were more likely to say that they would discourage their kids from doing so. And so we don't know what these demographic trend lines we're seeing on the youth level will mean for the makeup of the sport at the highest level. That's the NFL, of course. But we know the NFL is mostly black now and has been for a long time. And we know that the NFL and its former players have been in this tug of war over what the league owes them, especially as they get older and it becomes harder to ignore the neurological consequences that come from playing a violent sport from an early age. The NFL agreed to this huge settlement with ex-players who sued the league for covering up what it knew about the links between brain disease and playing football. Will is an investigative reporter for the Washington Post, and he looked into what happened after that big concussion settlement. Will and I started talking about chronic traumatic encephalopathy, what a lot of people know as CTE, which is the brain disease that's garnered so much attention after studies showed just how much football players were particularly at risk for it. And he told me that brain disease, when it comes to football, goes way beyond CTE.
When I meet with people and talk to them about the NFL and professional football and brain disease, one of the first things I say is I think that a focus and an obsession on CTE kind of subsumes the larger issue here, which is just that if you play professional football for a long period of time, you are at higher risk for any type of brain disease that causes dementia. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS. CTE is one of those diseases. It's a disease that can lead to dementia, that is believed to have some behavior-related symptoms, including explosive rage, that then progresses to dementia. But I think the bigger picture issue of that is that really regardless of what disease you're talking about, if you play professional football for a long period of time, you're just at higher risk for a long list of brain diseases.
And that's just because of the nature of the sport. Regardless of whether you have a concussion over the course of your playing career, that's not necessary to develop these brain diseases, right?
Correct. Yeah, it's just that there's just a raft of research now that has found just if you engage in any activity that has head trauma as part of it, like boxing, football, rugby, even soccer with heading. If you do that for a number of years, it's a similar relationship between smoking and lung cancer. Just the more years you do it, the higher risk you are at developing a brain disease.
Yes, and if you're a professional, obviously you've been playing football probably since Pee Wee League, so you have decades of, or at least a decade of play before you even make it to the NFL. So
right.
It's like racking up. Oh my gosh. And CTE, I know you said that CTE is not like, CTE sort of takes over the conversation, but one of the things that is true about CTE as related to these other diseases like ALS and Alzheimer's is that CTE is basically impossible to diagnose because you can't confirm whether someone has it until they die, right? You have to do it via autopsy.
It's impossible to diagnose whether or not someone has CTE when they're alive. That's correct. But it is possible to determine whether or not they have a brain disease that is causing dementia. There are a number of studies that have found that former NFL players are at least 2 to 3 times the risk of developing a brain disease that leads to dementia, as the regular population, as you would expect to see. with regard to CTE, there was one study that looked at, it was a couple of researchers who basically tallied up all the public cases of players who'd been posthumously diagnosed with CTE, and then added up all the former NFL players, period, who died in that time frame, and I believe they came up with a figure of somewhere in the neighborhood of 10%. They said that if to assume that we know through public reporting all the cases of CTE that are out there, that somewhere in the neighborhood of 10% of players in that time frame developed the disease.
We know a little over a decade ago, the attention that was paid to these brain diseases was becoming a really big deal for the NFL, which is, of course, by far the most popular and most lucrative sports league in the United States. And so then in around 2015, the league announced this major settlement, the concussion settlement, which is sort of the shorthand for it. So what were the details of this settlement deal? Like, how much money was in it? How many players were involved in it? What were the sort of conditions for eligibility?
So on the surface, this looked like an incredibly generous deal by the league that it was offering its former players. Essentially, the league agreed to pay any former player who'd been part of this class action lawsuit who developed a brain disease that caused dementia. Any of those players, the league said they would pay, they'd offer money for help with medical care. And then when a diagnosis was confirmed of Alzheimer's, dementia, ALS, or Parkinson's, the league would pay each of these players or their families, if they passed away, sums ranging into the millions of dollars. And it was an unlimited fund. It could cost the league billions, plural, and it's supposed to last for 65 years, so going through the early 2080s.
Wow. And so these are players who were involved in the class action suit. What does that also, just for clarity's sake, does that cover players going forward, like players who are playing now who are yet to retire?
No, I believe players going forward, so after that 2015 timeframe, I believe they signed some type of waiver when they're drafted and they start with the league. The issue with the players pre-2015 is that they argued when they played, they were not aware. They were not fully aware of the risks that they were encountering, the risks of later life brain disease, and that the NFL had misled them about those risks. After this settlement was put together, the NFL has now acknowledged that playing football can increase the risk of developing a brain disease, and the players who play today are aware of these risks as they decide, how long they want to last, how long they'd like to keep playing.
And so the league is basically saying, this is a risk you are you're taking this upon yourself. We are not liable for any sort of long-term brain-related health consequences you may face from your playing days.
A current player could not sue the league if that player developed dementia and said, you didn't tell me that playing football increased my risk of developing dementia.
Right.
The league has post-retirement benefits for players who develop brain diseases through the league's disability program. So current players can access benefits if they do develop these diseases. It's just not through this specific settlement. It'd be through a disability program.
Gotcha. Okay. So you said the fund you said is like virtually like limitless. There's no cap on it. There's like a bottomless amount of money they could pay out for the settlement fund. How much of that has been paid out so far?
So far, in excess of $1.3 billion, last I checked, to more than 1,700 former players and their families.
Wow. In your reporting, you've written that the settlement has been a broken promise in a lot of ways. The Post found that the NFL has routinely failed to get the money from this settlement fund to former players suffering from these brain-related illnesses like dementia and possibly CTE. So what is happening that is keeping the NFL or the administrator of the settlement fund from getting the money into the hands of these former players and their families?
Well, there are a number of issues, and I think one main one is that the settlement basically has its own definition for dementia that is different. It's different than how doctors normally diagnose the condition, and so There are many players out there who've been diagnosed with dementia, but they've gone through this process and they've been told, well, you don't have dementia as our settlement defines it. Your symptoms aren't as severe as we require, and therefore you're not entitled to money or benefits. And there are nearly, I think, in excess of 1,100 former players who've had claims denied now. And about 300 of those are players who were diagnosed by the settlement's own doctors. So these are neurologists vetted by the NFL, board certified independent, who are saying these guys have dementia, and the settlement is still denying their claim and refusing to pay them money.
There's some space between the board certified independent neurologist and the settlement administrators. That's what's happening. Like the settlement administration saying, yeah, you guys might be okaying these diagnoses and saying this is what it is, and that does not meet our stricter definition of dementia.
Right. There's an independent law firm called Brown Greer. They oversee this settlement. They're basically supposed to be like the referees or the umpires, sort of calling balls and strikes here, to mix sports analogies. And there's a small panel of review doctors who, if you're a former player and you file a claim, these review doctors read your medical records, and they ultimately decide who does and does not qualify. And in many cases, many that we wrote about, these review doctors and the firm Brown Greer, even though the settlement doctor says, I've diagnosed this player with dementia under the settlement, they still overrule the diagnosis and deny the claim.
When we come back,
there are these racial corrections applied to these tests. And for African-American players, what it did is effectively it assumed that they started off naturally performing worse on these tests. So it curved the scores up.
This message comes from Charles Schwab. When it comes to managing your wealth, Schwab gives you more choices, like full-service wealth management and advice when you need it. You can also invest on your own and trade on Thinkorswim. Visit schwab.com to learn more. This message comes from NPR sponsor Hiscox, committed to helping small businesses protect their dreams. Quotes and information on customized insurance for specific risks are available at hiscox.com. Hiscox, business insurance experts. This message comes from NPR sponsor IKEA. IKEA is hitting the snooze button on everything but rest and sleep. Why not turn your bedroom into the space to decompress? Shop the IKEA range of comfy beds, pillows, mood lighting, and so much more. Every time you step in there, it's nothing but me time. Sounds like a dream, right? IKEA has what you need to design a bedroom you'll never want to leave. Create your comfy, blissful bedroom today with the IKEA 6 Sleep Essentials. Shop in-store or go to ikea-usa.com/sleep. This message comes from Homes.com. Homes.com knows having the right agent can make or break your home search. That's why they provide home shoppers with an agent directory that gives you a detailed look at each agent's experience, like the number of closed sales in a specific neighborhood, average price range, and more. It lets you easily connect with all the agents in the area you're searching, so you can find the right agent with the right experience and ultimately the right home for you. Homes.com. We've done your homework. This message comes from Intuit TurboTax. Now, Taxes is matching with an expert backed by tech to get you the most money back at TurboTax.com. Experts only available with TurboTax Live. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
Gene, just Gene, code switch. We're talking to Will Hobson. Will's an investigative journalist. He covers sports for the Washington Post, and he spent the last few years covering what happened after the NFL agreed to pay money in a settlement to many of its former players who claimed that the league covered up what it knew about how bad brain disease was in football. And he says that for those former players, actually getting that money has not been so straightforward. One of the big stumbling blocks for those former players was that the firm in charge of awarding money from the settlement was using this practice called race norming to determine who should get what.
So race norming is basically kind of a shorthand term for this practice in cognitive testing, where your test results are curved based on a number of demographic factors. But for a period of time, and I think it's still a practice that occurs in some circles in neuropsychology, there are these racial corrections applied to these tests. And for African-American players, what it did is effectively it assumed that they started off naturally performing worse on these tests. So it curved the scores up. So if you were a black player and you were a white player and you got the exact same score on a cognitive test, the white player potentially would qualify for a payment, the black player would not. And the problem was, this was, from the perspective of former players and their lawyers, is that they didn't know they were agreeing to this. And there were cases where doctors felt that making these corrections wasn't fair because it was effectively treating black players differently than white players. And they tried to not apply these corrections. And the firm in charge of settlement, Brown Greer, mandated it. They said it was a requirement under the settlement. Ultimately, the NFL agreed to remove race norming from the settlement. So it doesn't occur to players now who go through the process. It did before 2021.
And were those players, those pre-2021 players, could they appeal their denials or appeal their settlement payouts?
They could appeal, and some did, and that's actually how this process came to light. There was a player who had qualified for a settlement payment, but I believe the review doctors overruled the diagnosing doctor, made him do this race norming, and then his lawyer challenged it, and that's what ultimately led to the lawsuit.
That is just such a it's like a shocking thing to hear you say, like oh well, they just assumed that black players had lower cognitive abilities as measured by these tests, therefore they were less likely to be paid out for having the same scores as former white players. But it's also true that the NFL has been mostly black for a long time. So it seems like one of the things that at issue here with the race norming stuff was that you're setting aside the population, a demographic population that makes up most of the universe of current and former players. What was the public reaction to this revelation that race norming was happening in these settlements?
There was a lot of outrage directed to the NFL, but as I found on this issue and this story, it lasted for about a week and then it went away.
Right. Why do you think it went away so quickly? Why do you think it tends to go away so quickly?
I think that in the public, there's a significant degree of apathy when it comes to the issue of professional football and brain disease, and I think the story feels sort of old to people. You
looked at the case of a former player named Reggie Brown recently. The administrator that was supposed to be in charge of dealing with the settlement money given to players like him was in the story you write that those people were scouring the social media profiles of these former players to basically say that, well, they didn't look like they had brain injuries in their online presence, right? Or that they might be embellishing them. How does the league or how does the administrator explain why they've been scouring people's sort of photographs to sort of deny them claims?
Right. So Mr. Brown is a former running back for the Eagles who has been diagnosed with dementia under the settlement, and he filed a claim late last year. And Brown Greer they reviewed his Facebook activity and Instagram activity, and they reviewed his tax returns. And they are holding up his dementia claim as they seek more answers for him about how he's able to do things like he claims he's a motivational speaker. He writes on Facebook about doing these things. He has traveled with his wife. And as Mr. Brown tells us, and as doctors and neurological experts have told us, just because you're able to work a little bit, work in some form or fashion, or travel, or exercise, doesn't mean you don't have dementia. It really comes down to the objective diagnostic work of the doctor. And in this case, the neurologist that evaluated him asserted under penalty of perjury, I believe this player has dementia. He has cognitive test scores that are consistent with a moderate dementia patient, but he is unable to get paid as of yet. They say that they have to be on the lookout for fraudulent claims. They have to be on the lookout for players who are falsely representing to doctors that they are impaired when they're not. And I do think those cases have occurred. But I think that problem, just based on my reporting, I think that was a more significant problem that they were dealing with in the settlement early on, the 2017 to 2018 timeframe, and that at this point. The lawyers that I talk to, the former players that I talk to, feel like if a settlement doctor is diagnosing you with dementia, the claim just should get processed in a pretty quick, straightforward fashion, because that's the way the settlement was described when the lawyers put it together in the 2014-2017 timeframe.
You've done a lot of reporting on this, like with a lot of former players. Is there a story that is like especially salient to you that really stands out to you? That you feel like the most exemplary of the problems with bringing forward these claims and these denials?
One that sticks out is Irv Cross. Irv Cross he played in the NFL, but I think to people in my generation, I'm 40. He was a broadcaster for CBS, and when he went through this process, his dementia, as his wife told me, and as his medical records show, was obvious to anyone who spent amount of time with him in his late 70s. He struggled to speak coherently. He often forgot to change his clothes. His wife told some really heart-rending anecdotes of Irv's later years, and when he goes through this process, the doctors document all of this, and but they conclude that while he has these conditions and he's been diagnosed with dementia, he doesn't appear to qualify for the settlement's definition for dementia. And he died 3 years later. At the time, the doctors thought he was suffering from Alzheimer's disease, but the autopsy found that it actually had been CTE.
Wow. And per the settlement, as you said, like he could not avail himself of any of that money, right? He
ultimately didn't qualify for any money under the settlement. When the settlement comes up, the NFL will often point to how much it has paid out as evidence that it's a great deal for the players. It's paid out, more than $1.3 billion to more than 1,700 players. But what those figures don't capture, and what they don't focus, what the NFL would not have you focus on, is that there are 1,100 players out there who've had their claims denied. And so if you tally up those claims, you're talking about billions, plural, on top of what the NFL has already paid out. And so I think both things can be true. I think the settlement can have paid out a significant amount of money to a lot of players, but there's a lot more players out there who also could have, maybe should have qualified.
Will Hobson is an investigative journalist at The Washington Post who covers sports, and he's been covering the NFL's concussion settlement. Thank you so much, Will, we appreciate your time.
Thanks, Gene. I appreciate it.
We reached out to the NFL about the so-called concussion settlement and the practice of race norming, and here's what they told us. Quote, the NFL is committed to paying legitimate claims of neurocognitive impairment, regardless of cause, over the 65-year term of the NFL concussion settlement program. Although race norms have long been and still are a standard part of neuropsychological practice designed to eliminate testing bias, we are pleased to have supported the efforts of neuropsychological experts in removing race as a factor in the program's assessment methods while ensuring diagnostic accuracy. To date, the NFL has paid over $1.3 billion worth of claim awards, helping over 1,800 retired NFL players and their families. End quote. And y'all, that is our show. You can follow us on Instagram at NPR Code Switch. If email is more your bag, ours is codeswitch@npr.org. You can subscribe to the podcast on the NPR app or wherever it is you get your podcast. You can subscribe to the Code Switch newsletter by going to npr.org/Code Switch newsletter. And just a little reminder that signing up for Code Switch Plus is a great way to support our show and to support public media. And you get to listen to every episode of the show sponsor-free. So please go find out more at plus.npr.org/codeswitch. This episode you're listening to was produced by Xavier Lopez. It was edited by Dalia Mortada and Jasmine Romero. Our engineer for this episode was James Willits, and we would be remiss if we did not shout out the rest of the Code Switch Massive. That's Christina Kala, Jess Kung, Leah Danella, Courtney Stein, Verlin Williams, and B.A. Parker. As for me, I'm Gene Demby. Be easy, y'all.
Support for NPR and the following message come from Boll & Branch. Change your sleep with the softness of Boll & Branch's 100% organic cotton sheets. Feel the difference with 15% off your first set of sheets at bollandbranch.com with code NPR. Exclusions apply. See site for details. This message comes from Bombas. Their socks are super plush, designed to support your arches and support people in need. One purchase equals one donated to those experiencing homelessness. Go to bombas.com/NPR and use code NPR for 20% off your first order. This message comes from Mint Mobile. If you're tired of spending hundreds on big wireless bills, bogus fees, and free perks, Mint Mobile might be right for you with plans starting from $15 a month. Shop plans today at mintmobile.com/switch. Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month 5 GB plan required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details.